comes down to love. Awe and wonder that I've experienced since childhood. To care about something and to love it that much, I have to protect it. I have to learn about it and teach about it. That's really the basis of the work. Love, and love of nature, love of beauty, looking at things carefully and taking time to study them and to let them teach us, to let them inspire us. It's the opposite of the soundbite culture of something that we look at for, a second and then move on. And it's an attitude of inquiring into beauty and of relating to the world more slowly, more deeply, and with more attention and connection.
That's photographer and science educator Robert Dash, whose new book, Food, Planet, Future, is a study of regenerative agriculture in both photographs and ideas. This is Down to Earth, the Planet to Plate podcast, a co-production of the Radio Cafe and Quivira Coalition. I'm your host, Mary Charlotte Domandi. We'll be talking about the book, including the photographs, on today's podcast. So if you want to take a look at some of the pictures while you're listening, you can go to the show notes at downtoearthradio.com and you'll get to see a few of the images. We will get to our conversation with Robert Dash right after these announcements. High Country News is a nonprofit, reader-supported publication that has been covering the West's land and communities for more than 50 years. Go to hcn.org/trial to get 2 print issues and 60 days of digital access to all of HCN's reporting for free. That's hcn.org/trial. Quivira's fall field season is kicking off this month with offerings in person in New Mexico, Texas, Colorado, and over the web. Topics include mental health and stress management for food producers, soil health on rangelands, virtual fencing, and land art. And of course, the Regenerate Conference is happening in Denver in November. Check out the schedule at quiviracoalition.org/events and get yourself registered soon. You can also go to regenerateconference.com. And now to our program. It's a great pleasure to welcome Robert Dash. He's an award-winning photographer and science educator. His photographs have been featured in National Geographic and Time magazine, and they've been exhibited in galleries and museums internationally. His latest book is Food, Planet, Future, The Art of Turning Food and Climate Perils into Possibilities. Welcome to Down to Earth.
Great to be here. Thanks so much.
It's an incredible book. You are both a photographer and a science person, and I want to talk about the connection between those two things. But first of all, how did you decide to do a photography book on regenerative agriculture, photography and text about what you're photographing?
There's just so much to tell about this topic, and blending the art and science, blending awe and wonder, which is really the purpose of my photography, with the stories behind a particular food, it just to me made total sense and total fascination.
You've been studying plants since you were in college.
Yes, I did. A couple years before going into education, I was doing natural history, botany, zoology, ecology, and much interest in the systems that really keep the world functioning. Photosynthesis, decomposition, and the way things interrelate. Jumping far forward here, I was really interested in environmental conservation for my career and as an educator. When you think about protecting nature, you have to talk about agriculture and you have to talk about food.
Well, yeah, and that's what we talk about here on this podcast pretty much all the time, but it's something that not everybody in sort of the wide world knows is that deep connection between conservation and agriculture. But let's talk about the photographs for a minute, because they're so interesting. Each photograph pretty much has a macro and a micro image in the same photograph. It's a collage. It's usually a plant, not always. Talk about this concept, this collage, the macro, the micro.
I've been fascinated by the micro world since I was a kid. And at that time, as a 4 or 5-year-old, collecting tadpoles, salamanders under logs, and frogs and things, I've always looked at things up close. And when I had access to a microscope in 5th grade, studying one-celled animals and drawing them, I just have always been fascinated. I've been a naturalist for a summer in a national park in the Olympic Coast here in Washington State. And I was always just thrilled by bringing people up close to things and looking at things they'd never seen before. When I got access to a scanning electron microscope, obviously that opened up entire new worlds. And to apply my photography work and photography sensibility to the micro world, it allowed me to not just make a scientific illustration, but an artistic, photographic, beautiful composition of something that was smaller than the head of a pin.
Yeah, I mean, they're amazing pictures, and the micro piece is always black and white. And I wondered, do you lose color when you go that small?
Fascinating question. With a scanning electron microscope, there is no color definition. You are just shooting a beam of electrons that reads the relief and the texture of an object. It does not read color. So people go in and add color. I'm not a painter, so I don't go there. Rob Kessler and Wolfgang Stuppi have just released the second version of their book Seeds to the same publisher, Papadakis, that I have. And I think that they do the best job I've ever seen of coloring scanning electron micrographs. For myself, I love black and white, and I love the abstraction of it. And these images that have the mix of color and black and white, to me, they add to that contrast of my art, contrasting tiny things with large, with black and white with color, fact and metaphor, art and science, and the variety of textures as well. It adds so many layers to an image.
Part of the goal that you had with this book was to make a book about topics like climate change and carbon sequestration without having a big carbon footprint yourself. Were you able to do that? How did you go about that?
Great question. So many things here I could find from local growers in the San Juan Islands where I live. Many people are passionate about experimenting and trying things from other parts of the world, for one. So I did discover some things like rice being grown here and quinoa that's being grown that allowed me to tell those stories. I also had things sent to me, say from Florida, where someone sent cacao pods and coconut flowers, which is a whole other story. Several pounds and several feet of this package that came in. Someone sent me agave from Arizona, and from that perspective, bringing things in, having them sent to me, mostly things were photographed from close up and close to home here.
Very interesting. The photographs, I love how you said fact and metaphor. I mean, the photographs tell visual stories, and then you also tell text stories that the reader can read. There's text next to each picture. So, for example, you've got an image of a green asparagus spear as we know it, recognizable. And then next to that, like in that same collage, is a close-up of the same thing with so much unexpected texture. I mean, just the texture of the things in our lives that we're not able to see because we don't usually look through microscopes. It's just so fascinating. But tell us a little bit about the story of the asparagus plant, which has a pretty high carbon footprint, especially when it's not in season, and there's a lot of politics around how it's grown and harvested.
Absolutely. It's so fascinating to think about, what food do we come upon in the produce section? Where did it come from? How did it get there? What is good news and what's bad news? Asparagus is a perennial, which is wonderful, but in many cases, it's not available for people who are looking for it in the off season from their area. Much of it is grown in Latin America, especially in Peru, in areas where the water supply is actually drying up and glaciers are melting. But that asparagus, when it's flown, obviously, versus shipped, flying food across the planet has the highest carbon footprint that I know of for any kind of food. So when we say, in the middle of December in the UK, we want asparagus now, and we're going to bring it in from Peru, that's what is so intense about that carbon footprint, which is absolutely different if you're just buying it locally or something that's grown in season.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think about seasonal eating. Like I'm half German, and I try to go to Germany to see my relatives. I was there not too long ago, and I always go to visit in May, which is asparagus season. And so there's asparagus everywhere. Everyone's eating it. It's on all the menus. There's asparagus side dishes, asparagus soups, asparagus omelets. And then it goes away when the season is over and you eat other things. And that's something that it's not just a German thing. I think probably many countries in Europe do really specialize in their seasonal vegetables, but we don't in the United States. Not so much.
And we have this expectation that we should have access to it in the modern times. That's our right or our cleverness or something, but at a tremendous cost and footprint, like you mentioned.
Do you try to eat seasonally?
Definitely, as much as I can. And otherwise I'd be going against everything I'm writing about here. So,
you live in Washington State on the coast in the San Juan Islands, and one of the images in the book is a before and after of a dam that was removed, dam removal, and its effect, and you talk about its effect on salmon. Tell us that story and how it played out both ecologically and visually.
Well, there's a spectacular example here of rewilding, as in returning a part of a habitat or an ecosystem to its original state. The Elwha dams on the Elwha River on the Olympic Peninsula, and then now 4 dams on the Klamath River down in Northern California have also been removed. And that makes an incredible difference for access of the fish far upriver, which gives them more breeding territory to support their ability to replace themselves. And visually, what has happened there and what I show in the book is a tremendous amount of sediment that was, you could say, sequestered, locked up behind the dams, released. And what that creates is this delta at the mouth of the river, which is a tremendous place for an estuary that supports the bottom of the food chain all the way up to the top of the food chain. The middle of the food chain would be the salmon, and then the top of the food chain would be orcas. And in the Salish Sea here, the southern resident killer whale orca population has been almost decimated and is considered to be threatened. So by rewilding this river, removing the dams, increasing the food supply, there's a real chance of having more food for the orcas. So you can see several different aspects of that have a lot of consequences.
And you don't eat salmon for that reason?
I very, very rarely.
I mean, that's also a conversation that is rarely had. I've only heard a few people ever talking about it. The fact that it's important to leave fish in the sea for other marine animals, whether they're mammals or other fish or whatever. And, the harvesting of fish for cat food or for fish oil and those things actually deprives the habitat, all the beings in the habitat. It makes one sort of sick to think about it.
Yeah, the idea of eating with the rest of the planet in mind, you could say that's one of the sub-themes in the book.
Yeah.
How is nature being damaged by our habits. And I started the book and started the research 6 years ago looking at how the food system was falling apart related to climate issues. And the further I looked into it, the more I saw things coming together. And so that's where the subtitle comes here, Turning Perils into Possibilities. There are so many examples of wiser ways of doing things. We're talking right now of our attitudes, our habits, our feelings of, we're entitled to this food, right? Or we're entitled to asparagus at a certain time of year, or we're entitled to salmon because we love it. But just the attitude of we could even reduce by half would be dramatic. To have just less frequently of something that has, that kind of impact would make a huge difference.
Tell us some of the examples of the turning climate peril into possibility through food. What are some of your favorite examples in this book?
Just to go back a moment, you talked about, bycatch in fishing and fish being used for fish meal for feeding pets and things. There's actually a methane-loving bacteria that feeding methane to this kind of bacteria produces a product that is equivalent to fish meal in protein or in calories and in nutritional value. So 2 problems with one solution. Taking methane from the atmosphere, which is a tremendously dangerous greenhouse gas, and then also feeding that to fish and reducing the demand for fish meal from the ocean, for example.
Right.
So that's a tremendous one. There's another fascinating one related to the ocean, and that is kelp and kelp farming and the restoration of kelp forests, which are tremendously important for the food chain. They're also important for reducing ocean acidification and, to some extent, carbon capture as well. And we snorkel a lot here in the cold Salish Sea with wetsuits. And we have seen over the years these beautiful walls with kelp basically grazed to nothing by urchins. Urchins have exploded with the loss of many sea stars that have wasted away. There are companies that are, especially along the California coast where the same issue exists, they are harvesting the urchins. Let me back up to say, urchins can damage a whole kelp forest and leave it barren. And then the urchins themselves have no food, but they can sit for a couple decades without eating, and they're almost shells, but they're still alive.
It's unbelievable.
Yeah.
That they can go decades
dormant.
Without eating these
dormant,
sea urchins.
Right. Yeah. So companies are taking them from the ocean and feeding them on land and selling those as good food for people who like them, but in the process also clearing them and then replanting the kelp in that area. So, twisting the story, finding something that's a problem and turning it into an asset.
And for anyone who has ever tried sea urchin, I had it one time in a sushi restaurant, and it was very fresh and very delicious.
Right. So better to take the far overabundance and the damage they've done and turn it into an asset and reclaim the forests there. That's kelp forest, that is.
Another example that you give in the book is buckwheat. Tell us about that.
Buckwheat is a fascinating, basically it's not a pseudo grain, it's a highly nutritious, protein-rich food that has gone out of favor in many places. And some places people would say, oh, this is a poor man's food, and we're going to replace it with white rice, in some developing countries. It is a great resource for cover crops. It can be used for cover crops that help rebuild soil as a nutritional value and an alternative to wheat It's not wheat itself, but again, highly nutritious and something that could be cultivated much more. And it does well in degraded soils and hot temperatures, and what you could say more likely in the future, the kind of climatic conditions, these kind of foods can flourish there.
I mean, it's interesting when you talk about cover crops because it seems like buckwheat is something that could be used as a cover crop, but also then turned into a cash crop.
Right. Yes.
Are people doing that?
Yes, in places. There's a few different kinds of buckwheat, some of which are considered more of a nuisance, and then some, like the main one was a food crop, is absolutely not.
Most of the images in the book are of plants, but not all of them. You've got a section on biochar, and you've got one on rock dust. Tell us about those two things and why you included them in the book.
So in the title, Food, Planet, Future, I was focusing first on food, but we're talking about the ecosystem. We're talking about how things are interrelated. So absolutely, if you're talking about soil, you're talking about water cycles, you're talking about invertebrates in the soil or fungi or pollinators. All these things might not be considered food, but they are the supporting structure that makes food possible. So biochar is fascinating. That's something that has been looked at for millennia in the Amazon, where it was kind of discovered that we think of the Amazon as this extraordinary wilderness. Much of it has been impacted by human interaction over millennia. And part of that was through the creation or the use of biochar, which is basically charcoal remains of food products or wood or other substances that can go in the soil. That biochar stays for hundreds of years without breaking down, versus what we know of for decomposition, where everything is turned back to the soil and carbon, is released. So biochar can be made from many different items. I have an example in the book where it's made from Japanese knotweed, which is a tremendous invasive species.
Well, and it's interesting because, I mean, the biochar, it's burned in a kind of low oxygen situation, so it's not fully burned. And so it stays, as you said, for centuries in the soil. And the close-up picture, that microscopic picture that you have, it tells why it's so valuable, because there's a gazillion little holes, and they call biochar, what is it, like hotels for microorganisms?
Yeah, microbial hotel.
Yeah, so you can see all the little rooms for the little micro people.
All the rooms. Well, there's a massive surface area. I've heard some estimates of like a football field contained in a tip of a finger or something. So water is held there, and microorganisms, and all of which is crucial for soil health. So we mentioned also rock dust. Rock dust is typically found from basalts, which is extremely common on the planet. The example I have in the book came from asphalt shingle waste, right? When you put stones on asphalt shingles, they're called fines. They're so small that they can't be used on the shingles. But that dust can be used with existing technology to be spread on agricultural fields. And in that process, that actually captures carbon in a way that it's a bicarbonate chemical reaction that takes the carbon in the dust and also takes more carbon out of the atmosphere. And that can last for hundreds or thousands of years. And that's another fascinating example of, helping agricultural practices capture more carbon and store more carbon, and in some cases possibly increasing the yields of the crops.
You balance in this book stories of destruction with stories of regeneration, and I imagine that it was a bit of work to find that right balance.
Yes, I don't want to hype the good news or sugarcoat the bad news. And there's definitely a struggle with so many kinds of foods, with agriculture, with production, with soil quality, with land use, and so forth. But there's amazing things that are happening. Ideas, research, practices that have been around for a long, long time. And so finding especially a focus on what's going well and what can work. I think we have enough of really bad news. And I really wanted to, like you say, I wanted to skate that fine line of being not hyping something and not being, overstating it, but definitely celebrating what I think is innovation, imagination, intelligence, and real solutions.
Some of which go way, way back.
Yes.
Traditional practice, indigenous practices, and so on.
Absolutely. Yeah.
There's a section in the book on the potato, and in the Sacred Valley of Peru near Cusco, there's something called the Potato Park, which is all about maintaining potato biodiversity and access by all people to potato genetics. The thing that struck me most about that was the picture where the potato starch granules look pretty much the same as the potatoes, even when magnified 1,000 times.
Yes. I have been to the scanning electron microscope lab 100 times over the years, and I've looked at hundreds and hundreds of foods. And there's, oftentimes I'll look at something and go, okay, next, let's try the next sample of something else. But when I find something where my jaw drops, I have to work with it. And that was an example.
Was that one of them?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that was an example, as is, the buckwheat starch granules are also mind-blowing. But the funny one about the potatoes is that image took me about 3 years to do.
Why?
It wasn't continual, but when I'm working on a composition, combining assets of something, there's a conversation between the color and the black and white, the macro and the micro, the textures and the patterns of each. And if they work together and they click, I know it. If they don't, I just set it aside. Like, I can't see this conversation working. These guys aren't in a good relationship or what have you. And it wasn't until, like I say, it took me 3 years. I went back to it again and said, oh, wait a minute. Those starch granules, those tiny granules are like potatoes. And so I made the other potatoes be the same size, and that was that.
How, if I may ask, how did you get access to a scanning electron microscope?
Yes. In the San Juan Islands, there's a research lab called Friday Harbor Labs, which is an international marine ecology laboratory, and they have one. And on my first book, I was doing a study of the property where we live and all the layers of beauty I could find. And I thought, I need to see if I can find a scanning electron microscope to get smaller and smaller to the surface of a leaf or to the underside of a fern or a feather that I found on the land. And I looked around. I was teaching at the time, and I said, I'm an educator working on a project, and the lab director said, come on in, I'll show you how to do it, and here's a calendar.
Nice.
Sign yourself up. And it's been an unbelievable, mentorship on his part, and an opportunity just to go there.
Yeah, and as a photographer, you're kind of learning a whole new artistic craft from scratch.
Absolutely. I love to hike. I love to travel in the wilderness. And to me, it's like hiking over the surface of a leaf, going, the distance of half a pinhead in 2 hours.
Right. That's so interesting.
And they are like landscapes, what you can see there.
Yeah, yeah. One of the things, it was kind of a clever composition of the blueberry, which was made in the same style as the 1968 photograph of the Earthrise picture taken from the first astronauts to go to the moon of the Earth rising. And you've got the blueberry rising, and then you've got the texture of the blueberry skin, which I never would have guessed it looked like that in a million years.
It's actually the texture of the blueberry seed.
Oh, it's the seed. Okay, that makes more sense.
Yep, and if you go on the next page, you'll see the blueberry seed, in a full spread. But yeah, that one was very entertaining to create. It happened almost instantly. As soon as I removed the background of the blueberry and had the black background, I thought, that's the earth is a berry, delicious berry, and I had the seed foreground, and that to me is also part of the contrast in the book. There's got to be some humor and some whimsy there, along with the serious and the tragic, and that's just the kind of the rich depths of life, right? There's so much to it.
Another story you tell is about the importance and prevalence of very small farms around the world. Tell us about these smallholder farms and their importance in the big picture.
Sure. Well, estimated roughly 30%, I think is the figure there, of all food production comes from farms that are basically roughly 5 acres and less. So that's a huge impact. And it tends to be a place where, a lot of experimentation can happen. It's also a place, especially in the developing world, where people may be growing food for their own use, or in other cases, just to be able to survive, basically, but they're still barely paid well enough, and they're very, under-supported. So it's bizarre that these groups of people, often with family farms back through generations, have such an important impact, but are also not supported well. There's a section there looking at Africa where there is not a lot of examples of giant agriculture. Most of the agriculture there is smallholders. And what is a little more than a little concerning is there's huge investment going into Africa to develop these monocultures and concentrated production facilities that would destroy these smallholder farms. Also, that displaces villages and communities and damages, especially if it's following up on some of the practices that have been so damaging to the climate and to biodiversity. If those are repeated in Africa, then we're going in the wrong direction. So the diversity of food production and of trying to maintain villages and family life is so important.
And the knowledge and the stewardship
Absolutely.
That are contained in them.
Absolutely. Well, an example of the potato guardians in Peru there, people pass down their potato, basically seeds, over generations, and they know when they're in the field, here is a variety that is no longer successful at this altitude, or with the climate change, or this with the droughts, or what have you. And they can tell there's a shift. Oh, here's a few plants that have actually flourished, and we're going to now develop that as a new cultivar. And again, they're potato guardians who've been around for centuries, passing through families. They know the soil, they know exactly what's happening, and they know the changes. And that is an incredibly intimate knowledge in comparison to a multinational corporation coming and saying, we're going to take over this village or this whole region and plant one crop.
Another important topic that tends to be overlooked is the reality of global cooling through agriculture and cover crops and forests and indigenous agriculture and land stewardship. And this has nothing to do with emissions or drawdown. It's all about the water cycle.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely fascinating. That was one of the things that really surprised me in my research. The more you read this kind of thing, the more fascinating it gets. So much attention, and where I even started out looking at climate issues was Renewable energy is where it's at. We've got to stop burning fossil fuels, which is true. We definitely have to move in that direction. But the other very significant leg to the climate issue, if you look at two legs, one of them being burning of fossil fuels, another is land use and land misuse. And the water cycle is absolutely wrapped up into that idea. There is an Italian researcher who recently passed away, Milan is his name, who has shown how drought in the Mediterranean and in some of the Mediterranean countries is absolutely connected to deforestation in that area, and how traditionally a natural cycle would have a local region cooled by plants. You'd expect that, creating an entire small water cycle in an area. And when a lot of deforestation is happening, it becomes a cycle that is difficult to exit from, because soils dry out, microorganisms in the soil die out, and then there's more erosion, and soils are hotter, and the air in the area is hotter, and all these things compound to reduce the ability of a local water cycle to be rich and to cool the area. I'm sure you know the experience of being in a hot street somewhere and then walking into a forest or something.
Even a park.
In a park. And you can go to an agricultural field, one next to each other, one that's barren, that's been eroded, and one that is rich. And the temperature would be, say, 30 degrees cooler where the cropland is compared to barren soil. Think about the value of fungi in soil. Fungi can release spores that become rain seeds. The kinds of things that happen in a system to encourage rain, to encourage cooling, are multiple, and they're present when the ecosystem is intact or when the land is intact.
And at the stage we're at, when we make decisions to do regenerative agriculture, when we make decisions to do cover crops, to do reforesting, intact, what's intact anymore, right? We have to actually restore. Right. And that's what so much of your book is about.
Right. Well, one of the principles of regenerative agriculture is to not leave any barren ground. So keep the ground covered. That's, you're cooling, you're protecting soil, you're enhancing the microbiome, and you are also, producing food and helping with water conservation.
I want to go back to the whole question of art. When you stop and look at nature close up, like even picking up a pine cone or looking at a flower or a blade of grass or some little, so-called weed with all these little seeds on the end of it or whatever. When you have that experience, it blows your mind. And we're so busy that we sometimes don't really stop to do that. But I feel like part of what you're doing is bringing that beauty to people in a way they wouldn't have seen it otherwise. So many of the things that are part of decorative art and textile art and things like that are directly lifted from these tiny, beautiful creations of nature. And I just wondered, how has that process affected? I guess you've been doing it for a long time because you've been studying this for much of your life, but how does it affect you, and how does it deepen your relationship between the art and the science?
As beautifully stated and beautifully asked, thank you. That is the core of the whole book and the whole purpose. It comes down to love. Awe and wonder that I've experienced since childhood. It has never left me. And when I get to see something that just blows me away, such as what I photographed for the book, it's almost painful. It's so powerful, it's almost painful. And to care about something and to love it that much, I have to protect it. I have to learn about it and teach about it. And that's really the basis of the work, is love, and love of nature, love of beauty, looking at things carefully and taking time to study them and to let them teach us, to let them inspire us. It's the opposite of the soundbite culture of something that we look at for a second and then move on in a gallery even. These images are meant to have a complexity and a layering to them that invite us to ask questions, to go, what's going on here? How does this work? And it's an attitude of inquiring into beauty and also of relating to the world more slowly, more deeply, and with more attention and connection. And I think that is an exact parallel to how we need to approach the climate crisis, with curiosity, fascination, and rather than doom and gloom, possibility, because that's the best of our human spirit. What's possible and how can we do something? And let beauty lead the way. And then the science part in the background is that facts are poetry. Facts become poetry. They're mind-blowing. When you talk about how something works, it's mind-blowing. It's a miracle that you could take a redwood tree and turn that into soil, that nature does that, and that all these minerals are cycled. Things like that they're impossible to believe, but they are art. And to me, that's just a great joy to explore it.
And it's interesting because the language of science and the language of art, I mean, you can say facts are poetry, but they're still quite different languages.
Sure.
And they're used differently. And I know scientists who experience awe and wonder, and yet that's not where they're living most of the day. They are different ways of seeing.
Absolutely. But I still think they are married in the center. It's about awe, and it's about discovery. It's about curiosity. It's about the mystery. It's all such a mystery, and trying to understand that mystery scientifically, asking questions, and also keeping an open mind to question your own discoveries. That's part of the mystery too, to say, I've discovered something, but maybe it's wrong, and to keep being curious.
And I think books like yours and art of the kind you do is the first step. And then each person who sees it then goes out and looks at something, even if it's just in the driveway, something growing in between the cracks of the sidewalk.
It's everywhere.
And then they have their own experience.
Absolutely. It's just there waiting to be connected with.
There's a quotation at the very beginning of the book by Adrian Rich, the poet, and I was wondering if you could read it for us.
Yes. My heart is moved by all I cannot save. So much has been destroyed. I have to cast my lot with those who, age after age, perversely, with no extraordinary power, reconstitute the world.
I thought the word reconstitute was so fascinating and important in that context, because it's like we're taking what's there, we're putting it back together, and it is people like you and me and all of our listeners and people at Quivira and so on who are not powerful, quote unquote, powerful people who are actually doing that deep work.
And it's happening, it's spreading. I think you could use regenerate the world, reconstitute. To me, that's the same idea.
Yeah.
So I think it's very exciting. And again, I think there is a tremendous amount of that work happening on a smaller scale, which leads to a bigger scale. And I'm very inspired by that. So I'm going to say just briefly here's a Mary Oliver poem, which I think is just another wonder. And this is kind of the core of the book as well. It's a very brief poem. It goes like this. Pay attention. Be astonished. Tell about it.
And that's what you've just done.
That's it.
The book is called Food, Planet, Future, The Art of Turning Food and Climate Perils into Possibilities, artist and science educator Robert Dash. Now, if people want to get a copy of this book, they can go to robert-photography.com, and I'm going to put a link to that on the show notes of Down to Earth. And it's important, I think, to buy the book if you're going to buy it from the artist, because then it doesn't go through middlemen and all the Jeff Bezos type of people who want to undercut you, especially with books. It's very important. So robert-photography.com.
And foodplanetfuture.com is another website. So both of those would work.
Robert Dash, thank you so much for being with us.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure talking with you.
You've been listening to Down to Earth. We would love it if you would support this program, which you can do by going to patreon.com/down-to-earth planet to plate, where you can sign up for as little as $3. Patreon is Patreon. And also please rate and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. The Quivira Coalition is a not-for-profit and a community network of ranchers, farmers, conservationists, scientists, educators, and many others dedicated to regenerative practices that produce healthy food, support meaningful livelihoods, sustain biodiversity, and remedy the impacts of climate change. To learn more about Quivira and how you can support their work, visit quiviracoalition.org, Quivira. And finally, this show is a production with the Radio Cafe. You can check out radiocafe.org to hear back episodes of this show and also find all kinds of other shows on a wide variety of topics as well. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.